So to help illustrate the CIA, let's talk a little bit about assets. And to illustrate this, let's think about a database that contains personally identifiable information or perhaps credit information. And we want to ensure that we're maintaining CIA AA. And in order to access this database, maybe there's a UI that users can access through a browser or something like that. The details aren't necessarily important here. But, the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're protecting confidentiality. So as it relates to confidentiality, what we typically will try to apply here is encryption. And we can apply encryption at the database level, and we can apply encryption at the transmit level here. So what we would do in this case is include something like HTTPS at the transport level. And then here in the database, we're going to use, we'll say like symmetric key encryption. And both of these will encrypt the data, whether it's at rest in the database or whether it's in motion across the wire. The next thing we're going to talk about is integrity. So as far as integrity goes, we want to ensure that this data hasn't been tampered with. And the primary mechanism for doing that is hashing. And there's a couple of derivatives of hashing that we'll get into later on. But the point being here is that what you want to do is create a fingerprint of that data in order to match to see whether something has changed in that data. If it has changed, then you have an integrity problem. So hashing gives us the ability to validate that something has not changed, that data hasn't changed. As far as availability goes, this means that when we're going through the UI here, we want to ensure that we have access to that data when we need it. And one way to do that is to build redundancy into the system. And you may do that by having multiple databases that fail over. You may have auto scaling. It really depends on your environment and the technology stack. But the thing to remember here is availability is achieved by creating redundancy and resiliency into the system. So the last two things are AA, which is authentication, and authorization. And in the case of authentication, authorization, here in authentication, we're proving identity. Authorization means what do we have access to? So as a user, you may come into the UI, you're going to log in likely with the username password. And from there, the application is going to make a determination as to what you have access to. And so that, again, is completed more at the UI level. But there's another consideration to think about here as it relates to authentication and authorization. And that is that you may have accounts that have access to the internal workings of the system or the application. So this would be a support account or internal accounts for the organization that runs the application. They may have access to the web server, the application server, the cloud environment, the database, and so forth. And these are accounts that we would consider as privileged account. And a privileged account has a higher level standard for what's required from an authentication authorization standpoint. You can have tighter monitoring around this to ensure that whatever that account is doing has been monitored, that there's any alerts on maybe some activity that looks a little suspicious. Because again, these are accounts that have elevated access to the system, and by rights of having that elevated access are allowed to do more activities within the system than, say, your average account. So we're going to talk more about this throughout the class, but I hope this gives you a good overview of CIA AA.